Hello, everyone, and welcome to our Connected Consumer Series session, Removing Barriers to Global Commerce Growth, 3 Must-Knows for Successful Cross-Border Expansion. I'm Alicia Esposito, VP of Content for Retail Touchpoints, and this is a very fascinating topic for us at Retail Touchpoints. We've been covering a lot of expansion stories, a lot of best practices, and I think today we're going to uncover some really fascinating and nuanced best practices for you all today. So really excited to dig in. But first, of course, want to share a little housekeeping info here for you all. Of course, if you are new to Retail Touchpoints, welcome. It's great to have you all. Before you close out your time with us today, be sure to go to our main website, retailtouchpoints.com, and see all of the great content that we have available covering the latest and greatest in the industry. So we do everything from breaking news and trend stories to deep dive, tactical features, research, more webinars like this, and we even do podcasts and videos. To make things a little bit easier for yourself, I encourage you to subscribe to our newsletter. We have new installments going out several times a week, curating the latest and greatest content from us. And of course, join our community. We are on LinkedIn at Retail Touchpoints and on X, formerly known as Twitter, at our Touchpoints. We will be asking follow-up questions and keeping conversations going there as well. So be sure to share your thoughts along the way. And of course, beyond all the great content we have on retailtouchpoints.com, we also help with events. Our banner event, Retail Innovation Conference and Expo, really digs into the latest in connected commerce. This year, we're digging into the evolved customer journey and specifically the convergence of content, community, and commerce. It's a very fascinating topic, one that I personally am very passionate about, and we already have some amazing speakers lined up, including Babylist, P&G, Primark, so many more. Honestly, just go to rice.events. You'll see our speaker lineup right there. And the event is taking place June 4th through 6th in beautiful Chicago. Again, be sure to sign up for updates there. You can get the latest and greatest details delivered via email, and hopefully we will see you there. And now a little bit about our platform today. We are using On24. If you've joined us for webinars before, you know kind of the basic details here. So we have an area in the top corner where you can submit questions. Like I mentioned, we're going to be sharing a lot of great insight and best practices. So you'll likely have some follow-up questions. So put those in there when they come to mind. We'll be doing Q&A at the end. And then we have our resources section right below that. We have a fantastic guide for you available for download from our friends at Vertex and Adobe that digs into this topic a little bit further. That way you have a nice follow-up conversation, nice follow-up resource that you can share with your team as well. And of course, we have all of our session details for the series in the bottom left corner where you can click on that, get more details. And then we have some basic functions like adjusting your volume and video features. And of course, we have our feedback tool. So our goal is to make sure that this experience is as seamless and enjoyable as possible for you. And of course, that the content is helpful too. So before you close things out today, be sure to share your feedback. We'd love to hear your thoughts and of course, share your feedback with our speakers as well. And of course, if you have any questions about the platform, leave us a question in the Q&A field, if it's content or webinar related or more functional questions, there's a help button there so you can get some more details too. All right, so we're shaking things up a little bit today. This is going to be more of a roundtable format, and I'm really excited to have 2 incredible experts on the line with me. First up, if we're looking at the screen, we have Jennifer Biester, who is a principal solutions consultant at Adobe, and she has a passion for transformational customer experiences. Too. She focuses on assisting clients in various stages of technology adoption, uncovering new ways to optimize their customer journey and streamline internal processes. With a background in brand experience and cloud applications, Jennifer understands the unique challenges modern companies face in today's market. And we'll be getting into some of those today too. Next up, we have Niall Kiernan, who is Senior Director of Product for E-commerce at Vertex. Niall has 15 years of experience in product management across finance and retail industries, and he joins Vertex as part of the Taxamo acquisition, where he was the head of product focusing on e-commerce and marketplace. So like I said, two very knowledgeable folks in e-commerce, in retail, and even in tax, which again, very complex. We're gonna get into it, don't worry, but we are in good hands. First and foremost, now, Jen, thanks so much for taking the time. Really excited to dig into this with you both.
Yeah, wonderful. Excited to be here today.
And I'm looking at the clock right now, and I'm already getting a little nervous because I know we have a lot to get into. First, I guess, the goal for me is to always kind of set the stage for our readers, for our viewers in this case. And I think it's important for us to discuss, what the opportunities are here, right? And I know this slide kind of breaks it down from two different lenses or perspectives. So maybe we do that. I guess the first question is, how would you define the cross-border commerce opportunity today? And knowing that our audience is primarily US-based, maybe we start by discussing the expansion opportunity into Europe. Jen, is that something you can share a little bit of insight on?
Absolutely. I think it is one of the biggest things that companies are talking about when thinking about expansion. Obviously, people want to talk about, okay, am I expanding my product set? Am I expanding the markets that I'm entering? But expanding into global markets is something that is on almost everybody's mind because of the immense opportunity that it poses from a revenue standpoint. Being able to go through and say, hey, I'm doubling my market size. I'm tripling my market size. I have the ability to go through and now sell to my key audiences in completely different demographics than I ever thought I would before. And especially when you're talking about the relationship between kind of the average North American shopper and the average European shopper, there's a lot of crossover in terms of the different opinions, the different needs, the different wants that people within these areas are looking for, which means that especially for companies, I think in this case, we'll talk about B2C. In the B2C realm, there's this big push to go through and advance globally because the shoppers tend to have a lot of similarities. And then from a B2B standpoint, you have the opportunity to enter into completely potentially untapped markets, which is a really exciting adventure from a TAM standpoint. So a lot of people are looking at this opportunity as a way to dramatically increase their reach and their revenue size, and something that most people are going to be really interested in.
Before we move on to the next point, I do just want to make sure that we hit on the other side, right? Like the opportunity for folks expanding into the US, because I know we have covered a lot of consumer behavioral changes, especially because of e-commerce and the access that it provides. What is the opportunity there? Because I feel like there is that untapped opportunity to reach these consumers that are so savvy, that want to discover and shop with global brands. I mean, is that kind of like a no-brainer as it relates to the global conversation? Jen, I don't know if you have any thoughts on this.
I think it's huge. We live in such a society where uncovering and discovering brands is second nature. You're scrolling through your favorite social media app. Brands have the innate reach to be able to, again, whether it's from North America to Europe or vice versa, to reach a multitude of customers. And you can probably tell from my accent, I might not be the greatest resource on, what a European customer is specifically looking for. Niall, I'm sure you have some opinions on that, but this eagerness that you mentioned to discover these global brands is inherent across a multitude of geographical regions, and discovery of a product or of a company is historically the hardest part. And now that we've made that so easy, it's about going through and seizing that opportunity.
Yeah, absolutely, Jen. And I suppose my generation, I think I'm sophisticated. I think though I've a daughter who's in her teens, and what you see now, it's funny. I had a friend over from Germany who has a daughter of a similar age. And he said to me, hey, your daughter's dressed the exact same as my daughter, right? And I said, well, that's funny because I was in the US and daughters over there dressed the exact same as daughters in Ireland as well, right? So I think now what you see with the rise of influencers, the likes of TikTok, right? That brand awareness quickly becomes very global. And again, we can't underestimate the sophistication of the people who are buying, you know, the customers online now, where they are aware, okay, well, maybe I might go and get this from North America because either it's not available where I am now, or maybe it's cheaper depending on exchange rates, whatever it may be, or I can just get it quicker, and vice versa again, right? So I think, you know, as merchants need to be aware of that sophistication of the shopper and be able to have, again, logistics in place, be able to serve customers in other regions and take advantage, right? Particularly again from Europe. Nowadays, I think English is generally the second language. So moving into North America, if you're selling out of France or Germany or somewhere, wherever it may be, actually isn't as big a leap maybe as it was 30, 40 years ago, right? The language is the same, the culture, westernized culture, that's all the same. So in some ways, it's easier for the European merchants to move into North America than it is for the North Americans to move into Europe. But we'll get a bit more into that later on. But again, lots of opportunity there to take advantage of. And again, more sophistication in the market.
Yeah, so interesting to see how the commerce side almost needs to catch up with the cultural side, right? Like there's obviously hunger there for brand discovery, and like they're consuming all of this content online about brands. It's piquing their interest. It's all about closing that gap, right? Being able to create access for them. So now you brought up some of those complexities. So we are going to get into the meat of our conversation, which is those three keys or imperatives that we need to break down as we think about being able to expand across borders successfully. So this first point is all about understanding your obligations. So the first question I have for you both is, what are some of the key nuances that merchants need to know before they even think about expanding abroad, right? Because we've laid out the opportunity is big, but as we think about regulations, compliance requirements, is there some key stuff under the hood here that we need to break down first and foremost before we get into any other tactical elements? Jenna, I'd love to start with you.
Yeah, honestly, this is one of those things where there's a lot to unpack, and it can almost feel like an overwhelming amount. So we'll probably chip away with it throughout the entire conversation. But the things that come to mind are, number one, are you allowed to sell whatever your specific product set is in a certain geography? And this might sound, very simple. Okay, hey, I work in a chemical compound industry. Okay, obviously there's going to be lots of regulations surrounding that. But I think a lot of people are sometimes surprised to find all of the different regulations for more straightforward B2C or direct to consumer products as well, such as cosmetics. There's a lot of regulations surrounding things like cosmetics, surrounding the ability to go through and sell anything, absolutely anything, in kind of the food and beverage side of things as well. So being able to go through and understand, am I allowed to even sell my products in certain countries is going to be very foundational. And sometimes it's not, going to be this giant stop sign that completely prohibits you from selling in those regions or in those countries. Maybe it's just a couple of your products can't be, shipped cross-border or something like that. From there, it's also your kind of tangible ability to be able to go through and fulfill orders. You heard me mention, being able to ship things cross-border. Okay, well, what's your shipping infrastructure look like? What does your inventory infrastructure look like? These are all going to be things kind of even before you get to, the complex regulations of taxes and customs and everything like that, and really getting down to the core compliance requirements of, can I sell things? And once you get those, big boxes really checked, then you can dig farther into some of the more monetary or taxation-based regulations as well.
Yeah, and I think as we think about the product level, we'll we'll kind of get into the nuances there, like how that impacts the customer experience and the site experience that you want to create for those customers, knowing that you maybe aren't able to sell all of the inventory that you would have on US, for instance. Now, Jen brought up the magic word, tax. Can you share any thoughts, insights into some of these key considerations, the regulations, compliance requirements, all of that fun stuff that that you live day in and day out, like what folks really need to know at a base level?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, yeah. And I think, Jen's touched on a lot of good points there, right? I always go back to business models. That's where my head lives. And the reason for that is if we think of the evolution of commerce over the last, whatever it may be, 15, 20 years. And I really think of that because if you think of the evolution of commerce before that, it was basically different types of stores that people walked in to buy something, right? Whereas over the last 15, 20 years, with the evolution of the internet, suddenly you see all these myriad of business models that people can choose from to sell from. And that's important because when you think of that, the tax regimes have to keep up, right? And they have to keep evolving their tax regulation and legislation, which means then merchants have to keep up with that tax legislation to ensure they're in compliance. I think one of the key components people regularly get caught out on is the legislators have realized that there's a lot of cross-border selling going on, right? And people hear a lot about the tax gap of these foreign sellers who sell into a country but don't pay tax. So the legislators are shutting that down as much as possible. And the key piece there is they tax now at place of consumption rather than place of sale. So in the past, foreign sellers or cross-border sellers used to be able to sell into a country and avoid paying tax in that country because the tax authorities weren't that sophisticated. Tax authorities are catching up now. And now it's, okay, where is the good being consumed? So if I'm selling into somewhere in Europe from the US, I have to pay tax in Europe. That creates nuances and challenges. Anecdotally, we had one company come to us to say they had cracked the tax problem because you paid zero tax or zero VAT in Dubai. So they were going to base their company out of Dubai. And we had to quickly tell them, yeah, but wherever you sell to, that's actually the tax rate that you're going to pay. And that tax regime will come after you for that money, right? So people need to consider that when I'm thinking about what countries I'm going to sell into, that's where my tax base. And that brings the challenges of actually being able to track, calculate, and pay the tax within that regime. And of course, there's knock-on effects. If you don't do that, brand issues, penalties, all that stuff. I don't want to put people off, right? Because it's manageable, but it's just to consider it, there's almost a tax logistics, tax management logistics that need to be thought of depending on what countries that I'm going to go and sell into.
All right. And then a quick follow-up question there, and then we'll move on to the next point because I know we're already deep into our time together. So there's also nuances between Europe and the EU too. Is that right? I mean, is there anything there that we need to get into as far as obligations?
Yeah, so I think the critical piece in Europe for the EU is that Europe doesn't equal EU, right?
Right.
And I think people fall down, right? They would have heard, about things like the import one-stop shop, right? Which is a tax regime across the EU specifically designed for cross-border sales. But it's EU is 27 countries within the EU that it makes up a subset of Europe, right? So for example, obviously, anyone tracking Brexit over the last few years will know the UK is no longer part of the EU. But there's some more subtleties. So for example, Norway isn't part of the EU. And there's certain little regimes within the EU that actually don't operate within the EU that again, people need to be aware of and follow that. So while the EU may have taxation rules, that doesn't necessarily expand to all of Europe, right? And again, people need to be aware of, okay, which countries are in the EU, which are outside, and therefore which tax regime am I dealing with?
So nuanced and so interesting too, like once we kind of peel back all of the layers. But when we think about expanding globally, I know a big part of the conversation, especially for our audience, which, they're digital folks, marketing folks, it's being able to adapt and create experiences that really align and resonate with the cultural preferences, not just behavioral preferences of different consumers too. And I think we kind of hit on the fact that there is a bit more alignment and crossover within these particular markets. But I do want to get into the notable distinctions or things that our viewers need to be thinking about, right? So Jen, maybe we start with you, and then now if there's anything you want to add, please feel free to jump in here. Can we talk about those notable distinctions between US versus European consumers and what they really want and expect while they're shopping online?
I think you hit the nail on the head with that idea of customer expectation. Our teenagers might all be dressing alike right now, but at the end of the day, there's always going to be cultural preferences or expectations of a company. And that can involve everything from how they're paying, kind of method of payment. It can be surrounding, am I paying my order all in one transaction, or am I doing kind of a pay-as-you-go or an installment payment, as well as the ability to go through and have different expectations from a shipping parameter standpoint. I think everyone in the US has gotten very used to two-day shipping with kind of this alignment of, I order it today, I expect it as quickly as humanly possible. Whereas, with some, shoppers and purchasers in other parts of the world, they are okay with slightly longer shipping lead times because it's something, if they're used to ordering things cross-border, they have different expectations. Anecdotally, I know, and this kind of extends outside of the US and Europe per se, but I worked with a company who a couple years ago tried to make a very large, very well-funded global expansion into the Asian markets. They had lots of market research as to why consumers were going to love their product. They already had a large social media following, and they couldn't really figure out why it didn't work. And it just, I won't say it was a huge failure because they were able to kind of readjust and correct their path a little bit. But what they discovered is that culturally, people in the Asian markets that they were looking to enter in were very used to being able to pay in installments. And this ability of going on and expecting them to pay the full amount in one transaction was just culturally not something that they were used to. And it was a major deterrent. So in thinking about this level of consumer-based personalization, in my opinion, it's an onion term. There's lots of different layers to it. A lot of people think of it as, well, change the banner image on the homepage. Okay, well, that's one version of personalization. It could be the ability to go through and speak to them in a natural language. Everybody needs to remember there's a very big difference between French Canadian and actual kind of French-speaking French. You make sure that you're not utilizing the wrong spellings or the wrong language and things. So being able to go through and speak to people in a personalized or contextualized manner is the bare minimum, but then understanding the shopping or procurement preferences of people within those countries is going to absolutely be a major aspect of success when expanding globally.
Excellent. Now, anything to add there from your perspective?
I think that the language is an important one, right? Again, as much as I talk to, Europe having a second language of English, right? That's to their benefit, right? But at the same time, the expectation is if you're going to set up a website in France and trying to sell in France, for example, that website's going to be in French. That's just the expectation. And also that the support person is going to speak French, right? They don't expect to ring someone up and have to adapt their language to meet the company's needs. It's just not the done thing. So, and that's generally the same across European countries, right? So that I think that's very important. The other thing I'd say in terms of behaviors, there probably is a bit more of an acceptance in Europe for a slightly slower, cadence of delivery and so on. But the logistics behind that is really important to understand. If you think of the US and where the warehouses are and that model of, having them in certain states and then sending out goods across those, that model's actually been replicated in Europe, right? Where you would have certain, depots in certain countries, but not in every country. And what that then leads to is obviously, regardless of if I'm purchasing something from Ireland again, actually, if the warehouse is in Germany, it's going to come cross-border, but it's going to be an inter-European cross-border, right? So a bit easier. There's still some challenges, but it's a bit easier. Versus if that depot is in the UK, it's now going to come from external to the EU to internal to the EU, and it's much more stringent. So again, there's those considerations of, again, what's my logistics channel for actually delivering the goods, and what's the expectation of the customer if they have to return those goods, right? Again, it becomes more of a challenge, and customs becomes a very critical factor in that. And why is that the expectation? Because, again, the US maybe don't have to worry as much about, I'm going state to state, customs maybe not as big an issue. Whereas if I'm going from the UK to Ireland, what you don't want to see is a package arrives on your customer's door and they get asked to pay a customs fee or a tax fee. That, terrible customer experience. No one wants to feel that. So again, those type of things to think about when you're thinking from the customer's perspective, their experience.
Yeah, I think that's a really important call out, right? Because it's not just about what the customer sees and engages with on, the website, right? Although that is very important, right? Like that's the entry point, that's the first core experience, so to speak. But after they say, like, yes, I do want this thing, they make the time to make the purchase, you have to make sure that that experience, again, from order to product is at the doorstep, is as seamless as possible, and it matches, right, with the experience that they had on the e-commerce site itself. So a lot of key considerations, I think, that are happening under the hood, so to speak, as folks plan to expand abroad. But to get into the final section or sector of our conversation is all about compliance, right? And, we've talked a few times about the nuances, the hidden aspects, things that maybe our audience hasn't thought of or considered in this area. So I guess now I'll start with you here. I'm curious, what are some of the key areas of compliance that brands need to consider and tackle in this whole process, right? Like, what are the big areas that they really need to know?
Yeah, so I think if we just start with cross-border into one country, for example, the areas you need to think about, of course, is again, we talked about that place of consumption model, right? So what are the tax rates I need to pay as I ship into that country, right? And again, depending on the goods, I would say tax calculation in the VAT area is simpler than tax calculation in the US, right? Far less jurisdictions, far less of these sort of stacked jurisdictions, where in the US I'm going sort of state, county, zip code for multiple tax rates on one product, right? Far simpler from that perspective. However, there are challenges in terms of determining what tax should be applied to the product. So again, people need to get advice, I would say, and think about that. That's sort of the first phase, if you like, right? Again, though, from a compliance perspective, once I'm collecting tax in that jurisdiction, I have to have a process in place to be able to actually remit the tax, to register in that jurisdiction, to comply with their, depending on the form I need to fill out or whatnot. And oftentimes, the only way to do that is some regulators in certain countries will dictate, hey, you need to have an in-country representative to actually carry out these processes on your behalf. So you need to build a relationship there. And if you take on top of that, actually, let's say I'm in the US, I'm paying, or I'm selling into the UK, there's an FX component involved, right? Which shouldn't be underestimated. Again, the regulators, so you can use whatever FX rates you want in terms of the actual goods transaction. But for the VAT, the regulators are starting to enforce, hey, we actually want you to use this FX rate. You can't just use any FX rate. Here's where it has to be sourced from. Here's the day it has to be used on. And similarly, when you're going to remit the tax, again, we want you to use our sourced FX rate. which again, a lot of people don't understand. It can be a challenge, which if you think of one country in itself is a challenge, but I always think of the multiplier. If suddenly I want to start to sell into, let's just say the EU, because it's Euro is one region, but then I want to do UK, Norway, maybe Switzerland, Poland is Polish zloty. Suddenly what I'm starting to see is a multiplier effect. And that then becomes challenging. Now I'm back into tax management operations rather than just, hey, can I just go and sell in this country? And what can I do there? So, I mean, that's tipping on the key components, but that's really something to start thinking about is what does that logistics look like of the tax management process?
So with all of this, this complexity and just being able to manage and understand these distinctions, I mean, you kind of hit on it slightly, but I just want to reaffirm it's that management piece that does become, I don't want to say not necessarily just a burden, but possibly a risk, right? Because then we kind of get into the, well, if you don't if you don't comply, then, you know, it ultimately leads to XYZ, right? So making sure you have, like, I guess my question for you is, you know, what are the challenges in this process? Is it just like keeping track of everything? Is it making sure you have the systems in place to be able to ensure you're complying with everything? I just want to make sure we really peel back the layers here so everyone understands the nuance that's at play.
Yeah, absolutely. So exactly that, right? It's one thing to go and set it up, okay, but it's the next thing to maintain it, right? And I think the thing to remember again is the tax authorities are responding to the evolving business models. So whenever businesses see an opportunity to change their business model for the benefit of the customer or the benefit for themselves, optimization, the tax authorities have to evolve to that. And again, those business models are evolving quicker than ever, right? Before the actual merchants then, who don't evolve their business models, but somehow get caught in the business model evolution, they have to stay up to date with all these compliance changes. And that can be anything, right? From different levels of, it could just be the tax rate changes within a region. Okay, how do I react to that? But it could be the FX source changes. There's things like digital invoicing compliance that you need to comply with a certain format of the digital invoice. So again, all that type of content stuff. And often people think of it in one country, but it's when you are broadening out into multiples of countries that then becomes a challenge. And how do you maintain it? How do you keep it centralized? You don't want to spread across Excels or data sheets or Word docs or who's managing what, right? It's really how do I get that into a system that's able to maintain, that someone's responsible for to go and maintain, and that we're working with companies who can actually help provide that data in and ensure that we're staying up to date.
And I put a lot on you there now. Thanks so much. Jen, anything else that we haven't touched on yet as we think about compliance that you think is important to call out before we move on?
Yeah, I think you put it really well earlier when you said, you know, a lot of this is stuff that you will be doing due diligence on kind of before you even get to that point, but maintaining it is something that I think can be achieved with a really aggressive attention to, it's the people, the process, and the technologies. Making sure you have people whose responsibility it is to keep an eye out for this type of stuff when there are changes in regulations or compliance. Having the people, whether that's boots on the ground or who have an understanding of localized language, who can help have conversations with your customers or, you know, even with government entities in those environments. And then from a process standpoint, making sure that you're constantly thinking of the iterative process. So, you know, if I'm going into multiple countries, you know, you at least have the baseline of what you're looking to accomplish down. So let's create a repeatable process of all of the different things that we need to check, kind of checkbox to make this possible for us. And then the technology piece is, selfishly where I know Adobe and Vertex are organizations that greatly want to help with things like this. I tell people all the time, I don't do my own taxes. I don't expect anybody else to do their business taxes. Utilizing a software to help alleviate some of that burden and provide really technology-based guidelines is going to be key. And then making sure that you have a commerce platform that enables you from a marketing standpoint to have those conversations in a multi-site, multilingual, multi-currency, different product assortment, all of those things where you're going through and you're achieving those customer expectations really allow you to go through and have these strong foundational technologies to really just make it a lot easier as you're going through this process.
Yeah, I like the way you broke that down, Jen. And I think this kind of brings it all together, right? Since we're just about at time for the core of our conversation. As we close things up, I mean, are there any final takeaways, things to call out, like how this people process technology approach that Jen outlined here can kind of facilitate or support the cross-border journey for all of our viewers? Any final insights into how they can best use technology to guide them through this process as efficiently and as effectively as possible that we haven't discussed thus far?
Yeah, I think technology, I always think of business as no one goes into business to pay tax. That's just, unless you're in a tax business, but you're not going into the business to pay tax, right? And again, everything we've talked about, really, it's around how do I optimize my tax process, and how much of it can I, not outsource, but make efficient, get support for, whether that's technology, people, process, whatever it may be. But really, as much as possible, the focus should actually be on growing the business, right? That's why we all go into business. We want to grow it, we want to improve it, we want to have better customer experience. So if my focus is on managing all this compliance and tax, then really I'm using up my resources that could really be focused elsewhere. And on top of that, like my experience is actually customers or merchants, I should say, do always want to be compliant. They try hard to be compliant for 99% of the time, right? The problem is the area is so complex. And again, we talked about changes so quickly. And how do I keep up with the legislation? And how do I ensure in this country I'm keeping up, whereas this country I'm okay, and so on, without having, again, a system in place or technology in place that's going to really take the majority of that burden off you. And, let even your tax team focus on the areas that are critical to reduce the risk or to give oversight into where that risk may be. Again, allowing for the business to actually move ahead and grow further. The one thing I would call out, around tips and so on, is one of the, I suppose, errors or mistakes regulars see, and when we talk to our customers, is the strategy is all built out, the business is ready to go, and then at the last moment, they say to the tax team, oh, by the way, we'd like your input. I think getting the tax team input as early as possible so that the risks are called out, as Jen talked to, it's part of that upfront strategy, and the actual tax management strategies in place to help with the business strategy is really key, because the worst thing you hear is someone's implemented a business strategy, and it all has to be rolled back because the compliance and tax aspect of it wasn't really understood, and now there's a tax risk there.
Great points. Jennifer, any closing thoughts on your side?
Yeah, I think that bullet point about customer experience always really kind of stands out to me, because there's a lot of studies, a lot of papers out there that talk about organizations that are really customer centric in their approach to things tend to honestly just do better. So the ability to go through and make sure that your customer needs, your customer experience is at the center of everything that you're doing, and then supporting that with the technologies that are, I call it digital manual labor. If you can avoid manual labor in any sense, I'm always down for that. So making sure that you have the technology that is making things easier for your internal stakeholders, it allows them to free up more time and effort to be more customer centric. So being able to go through and approach things in a way, as a final takeaway, I think there's that old saying, if you fail to prepare, you prepare to fail. And the preparation that goes into understanding the regulations, the requirements, it allows you to go through and really jump into a cross-border expansion with both feet, with the customer at the forefront of your mind, because you've already thought about all of the administrative things that need to happen prior to that moment. And I think that's definitely something that a lot of organizations benefit from.
Love that. Love it. Well, this has been a fascinating conversation. I love how you guys just organically play off each other. And I know there is so much more to dig into, but sadly, we're just about at time. I'm going to try and squeeze in a few questions from the audience first. But before I do that, again, just a reminder to all of you watching this now, if you want to dig a little bit deeper into removing the barriers to global e-commerce growth, just check out the resources section of the On24 platform that we're in right now. You will be able to download this 10-step guide, which again, reaffirms some of the points that we discussed today, but also digs a little bit deeper into some of the nuances, the intricacies, and of course the risks or issues that emerge when you cannot manage and effectively comply with a lot of the things that we discussed today. Like I mentioned, we do want to try and get into some questions from the audience. Reminder, if you do have a point that you want to raise with our speakers, just drop it into the Q&A tab there. If for any reason we do not get to your question, we will make sure our speakers get it. And then we'll either facilitate a follow-up conversation or we'll just share their response with you. Again, either way, we'll make sure your questions get answered. Just looking at the clock, I think we only have time for one or two. I do want to make sure we hit on this first one because I think it kind of ties to some of the points that you've made, Jennifer, around strategy. And this one attendee would like to know what preliminary strategy work does need to be done in order to ensure the right foundation or building blocks are in place for everything else that we talked about today, right? Who is in charge of what, who does what? I mean, give us as much breakdown as you can. I'm sure this is its own webinar in and of itself.
Absolutely. And even farther than being its own webinar, it's going to be completely different for every organization. There are going to be organizations where the push for global expansion or the push for cross-border expansion is going to be an edict from on high, from a board of directors, from a C-level executive. There's going to be times where you're going through and you're uncovering a market need or a market demand, and that might be based off of a lead form on your website. It might be based off of social media engagement. But ultimately, step one needs to always be data-driven. And going through and creating an initiative for some type of global or geographic expansion should always come from a data-driven decision, whether that's, again, demand from a market or identification of an addressable market within an international sphere. Once you've identified that need, it almost becomes easier to then address the more kind of, in my opinion, potentially dry aspects of international business, where you're going through and you're checking the boxes with the regulations and the compliance issues, whether that's shipping, product assortment, taxation is obviously going to be a huge one that I know we've spent a fair bit of time talking about today. But all of that stems from this initial data-driven decision to go through and make this jump. And then once you've checked all those boxes, again, putting the customer at the forefront of things, making sure that there's people within your organization who are responsible for these decisions is going to be a recipe for success every time.
Yeah, absolutely. And then that ties to, once you're live and, selling into these countries, like how do you continually improve that experience, right? Because the customer's always changing. You get to learn new things about how they're interacting with your brand and even just like the certain features and capabilities, payment options, right? Shipping options, and being able to turn that into a cycle of value for the business.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Awesome. So, okay, time for one more. And I want to hit on this question because it's a little controversial. So our one attendee wants to know why these expansion strategies fail? Like, what are the big 1 or 2 reasons, just based on your experiences, both of you? Like, what has been the indicator for failure? Any thoughts?
Yeah, I think from a tax perspective, again, it's just what Jennifer touched on there. You know, it's the lack of upfront planning and thought that goes into deciding to expand globally. It's very appealing to be a company who sells globally, right? But again, we touched on it earlier on, that there's a lot of considerations in terms of the business model, the logistics, where goods are starting from, where they're going to. Even if you're selling, you know, digital goods or streaming online, you know, again, the authorities are looking at every revenue stream they can get to close the VAT gap or the tax gap. And this needs to be a consideration. You know, I know, again, anecdotally, of one digital company who had to change their filing from 2 years previous because they hadn't realized, amazingly, and they were a hundreds of $1 million company, right, that effectively they had a tax liability in foreign countries, and they had to go back and impacted the share price and so on. So I mean there's stories out there where it's just planning, it's awareness, it's understanding of the legislation, and getting the right experts into the room. And then again, as Jennifer pointed to, what's the structure look like internally as to who owns what and who's ultimately responsible, so that to ensure that there's compliance with that strategy going forward.
Yeah. And I think, you know, everything now that you just said, I think that's going to be the crux of things from a regulatory and compliance standpoint. You know, if you don't pay attention to these regulations, not only are things not going to go well for you, but there could be ramifications of it. So it's always important to have someone who is, you know, has their finger on the pulse of those types of changes. And then, you know, from a more almost intangible standpoint, it's understanding your customers or your consumers in those geographic environments. You know, you can check all the boxes and do everything right from a regulation standpoint, and if you don't understand and create a positive and contextualized customer experience, then it doesn't matter how great all of your regulation compliance is, you still might not be as successful in those markets as necessary. So I think both of those sides of the coin are going to be incredibly important into making sure that you have this global expansion that succeeds from both an administrative, regulatory compliance standpoint, as well as a customer constituency standpoint.
I think that's great. Both areas or both worlds need to work in tandem, work in lockstep together for the strategy to be truly successful. I think that's a really great point. Well, folks, that was the fastest 50 minutes I think I've ever gone through for any sort of session, honestly, live or virtual. So thank you both so much for taking the time out to share your insights, your experiences, and thanks to the folks who submitted questions. Again, if we couldn't get to your question, we will make sure those follow-up discussions do happen and you get the answers you're looking for. And again, reminder, if you're looking for more information about your cross-border journey and how to really perfect and master that experience, definitely check out the resources tab there for you to get that guide. And of course, to all of you, thank you so much for joining us for this session. I know it's a very exciting topic, but it's also very complex. A lot of areas to explore, dig into, and of course, share with your team. So hopefully we gave you enough fodder and enough insight to share with your team. And of course, we have plenty other sessions coming up over the course of this series. So be sure to go to the link on your screen right here. Check out the agenda, sign up for any other session you find interesting. Of course, if you can't catch it live, it will be on demand. And of course, you'll also get the session on demand as well, so you can go back to it, share it with your team. Thanks again to all of you for joining us. We'll see you next time. Take care.